You're listening to One Free Family, a new take on peaceful parenting, where you can hear ideas for helping to raise free, independent, and peaceful children. Visit onefreefamily.com to connect and listen. Here are your hosts, James and Taylor Davis.
And we're back with another episode of One Free Family. This is James.
And Taylor.
And we are excited to branch out on another listener-driven conversation that was happening over in the One Free Family Facebook group. My favorite place on the internet. I think yours as well.
It is.
There have been so many just terrific success stories of people coming in there, sharing their issues, total strangers from all over the world. And this discussion was no different. So this discussion was raised by one of our very active participants in the group, and it was surrounding the idea of what to do when your house starts to fill up with toys. And a broader conversation continued from there around not only how to address this specific issue, which I thought there was some excellent feedback on, but it spurred a conversation between you and I about how do we prioritize which values we share will be like kind of strictly followed in our home.
Right.
Branched out to a broader conversation about like minimalism in general. And I think a lot of people that are getting more intentional with their life these days are looking at themselves and saying, I don't need all this junk, right?
Right. It's not bringing me the fulfillment I thought it would. And
exactly.
All of that.
And then all of a sudden they have kids and people start showing up with the junk in many cases. They'll want to give you things that you can bring into your home. Your kids might be attracted by the shiny objects.
Yeah.
Holidays, birthdays might feel like a great time for other people to give you more of these things.
And your kids then get old enough to be advertised to and see more things that they might want. Yeah.
Right. And so you become in this position. And I remember discussing this with our friend Jake, the host of the Voluntary Life podcast. I think we maybe even discussed it when we were on the air with him. And if not, maybe when we were there with him in person. And he had a great answer, which was, well, just because I'm a minimalist doesn't mean that my kids have to be minimalists. And I thought this was funny because if we're all sharing a space together, it could theoretically create some friction in the house to have this guy over here living the minimalist lifestyle while stepping on Legos and, just seeing like...
Well, having to carve a path through the playroom to get from one side to the other. Yeah.
Seeing bright colored plastics all over the place. Like that doesn't feel like minimalism, right? So I think minimalism is just one example of this.
Yeah.
I think there are a dozen, possibly more different kind of philosophies or lifestyle choices that parents could make that when their kids elect to not follow the same ones, that it can feel like a big challenge.
Sure, especially if the kid's choice to not follow that value kind of interferes with your desire to follow that value, then that can be a tricky thing to navigate.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be as simple too as like how people hope to spend their time, right? That's another thing we've discussed where and it's not exactly values, it's more like priorities, but
preferences.
Yeah, preferences. Like but it feel like when, especially outdoorsy people, let's say, outdoorsy people love the outdoors so much, and so much of the conversation among outdoorsy people, having been an outdoorsy person myself, it's a lot of uses the word outdoorsy, odd word.
Yeah, that was a lot. That was like 5 in 10 seconds.
A lot of outdoorsy.
Don't say it again. No.
Sorry, I'm crashing into it. But a lot of the talk in those communities is, aren't we all so awesome for being outside right now? Think about all those people that are inside. And
and I don't think it has to be that negative either. I think a lot of people... It doesn't have to,
but that is the reality. I've been there in those conversations.
Sure. I think, though, maybe what I would say, too, is that is a value. Like people who prefer to spend a lot of time outdoors also value it as like a beneficial way for kids to spend their time, and they see a lot of growth happening in their kids when their kids are outside. And so it becomes bigger than to people than a preference. It does kind of become a value, as in like we value this way of life. And I can respect that, and I get that.
Yeah, I hope it didn't come across that I wasn't respecting that.
Yeah.
Again, that's in a vacuum. If I was a lone wolf in the world, I would be outside a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I love to ski. I like to hike. I like to be on water. Outside is a place where I find a lot of peace and happiness. And I'm also just like throwing out there. Again, I think it's just a human nature to compare what you're doing and what you're choosing to your perception of what other people are doing. And in a lot of community, having been a part of, especially like countercultural or something that feels countercultural, being outdoorsy isn't really countercultural anymore, I wouldn't say, but it kind of feels that way when, say, all of your friends leave college and go work a 9 to 5 and you go live in a ski town. A lot of the people in the ski town are going to be reinforcing their own decision to move to the ski town rather than sitting around saying, oh, I wish I was working a desk job, right? I think there are a lot of little life choices that we can choose. And as we're choosing them, it can be very tempting to assume the narrative that not only is that what I prefer, but that there's also, it's sort of right too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes along with kind of something that we were talking about last week when we zoomed in on our hard day of parenting. If you haven't listened to that one, we really loved recording that one. Yeah. So check it out. But I was talking a little bit about how I think it kind of relates to the idea of the way that we choose to live our lives and the choices that we make feel like the right choice to us. And it can be easy to forget that other people are experiencing life in really different ways and that other people's preferences are different than ours and their preferences are just as valid as ours in many cases. They're just different, and it can be easy to forget that.
Exactly. And so one of the things I loved about this conversation in our Facebook group was a lot of times there's very practical middle grounds that can be reached if we set aside kind of an absolutist approach to like an all or nothing approach to wanting these things for our family, right? Because like on one hand, again, my ideal household, again, if I was the lone wolf anywhere, I wouldn't have any plastic toys to trip over. I'd have very little probably, right?
Yeah, you would.
I would have my computer. I'd have a place to sleep. I'd have some furniture, maybe some pretty pictures on the wall or something. But as far as like stuff goes, I'm a pretty easy to please person. And does that mean, though, that just because that's my ideal living space, maybe some books, just because that's my ideal living space, does that mean that that has to be the living space that I live in, given that I have kids now, too?
Right.
And I thought a really, like, and we'll just zoom in on a few of these different topics to try to find a good example of middle ground. But our friend Kelly, who's also in the Facebook group, talked about the toy question in her house. I get the sense that they like the outdoors. They're not probably huge fans of tons of toys either, but basically they have some storage area in their home, and then they have like the main area where everyone spends their time. And it was as simple as a conversation around, well, here are the shelves that we've allotted for toys. There's only so much space on these shelves. And, also just taking the temperature of her kids and discussing how like her kids only engage with so many things at a time anyway, and saying, hey, if we want to bring some things out of the storage area, great, let's do that. And in the meantime, let's just make room for that by taking some things off these shelves and moving them up there, right? Which is to say, we're not going to have these shelves plus every square inch of flooring in our home in order to fill with toys. It's acknowledging the kids' desires to have some of these objects to engage around, and just also creating a healthy space probably for them mentally, so that, I don't know, when they go to relax at nighttime or whatever, this is just total speculation, they don't have to be tripping over toys or have to look at a huge pile of plastic toys or whatever, right? Yeah. So, and it sounds so basic, right?
But I think it's the idea, again, of it's not an all or nothing, it's not a this or that, and it doesn't have to be. I think that I find myself getting caught in that kind of mistake quite often. Like it has to be this way or this way, and those are the only two options. Right. And almost always, and I think in a little bit we're going to talk about non-negotiables, where for our family, like we do have a non-negotiable or two when it comes to values.
Yeah, definitely.
But aside from whatever your few non-negotiables are, there's quite often a middle ground. And we talk about this a lot. We talk about problem solving and creative thinking and thinking outside of the box and inviting everybody in the family into the conversation about how to navigate this difference in values that we have and get to kind of a place that feels everybody can live with, is a good way. You've used that phrase before when you talk about coming to consensus. So yeah, I think there's so much room for creativity and for middle ground, and we can kind of talk about a few different areas for that today. I love the toy rotation idea. I mean, we kind of do that. I don't even know if you know, because I mostly deal with the toys going in and out, but we kind of do that casually in our house. Like we have a spot like in the basement where toys that aren't being used go down there. And I try to keep it a little bit less cluttered upstairs. And our kids know that the extra toys are down there. And especially our 6-year-old, he'll think of a toy that he hasn't played with a long time and get excited about it, and he'll just go down and get it, and that's totally fine. And we don't make a big deal out of like, well, now you need to go put something else down in the basement. Sometimes I will just see something that same day that nobody has touched in months, and I'll just go put it in the basement, and nobody gets upset because they know it's there and they know they're welcome to go get it when they want it.
Yeah, I like that approach. This feels a lot better to me than one of the other things that had come across our radar, which was the idea of first you start by putting in the basement and then you kind of just like get rid of it without checking in with the kids, because And, this is just a hard topic for me in general, because on one hand, we bought the house, right, with the money that we earned. And as somebody who believes in property ownership and people who buy something probably should be the people who get to make a decision with it, I think when we bring kids into the world, especially if our goal is to help them learn responsibility, it makes good sense that they should own some things. They should have some space to call their own if it's possible.
Totally.
It's not possible for everyone, but if you do have room in your house that your kids can start making decisions and making these kind of economic decisions of like, okay, this is how much shelf space I have. There's this, and it's a reasonable scarcity. It's not something outrageous, but helping them to come into the conversation as much as possible, even if it's a bigger hassle, but understanding that hopefully, like probably the point isn't to, as quickly as possible, get the right number of toys in the room. It's to help everyone experience growth and figure out their relationship to stuff and just like bigger goals than I just need a few less toys in this room.
Yeah, and I think that when I've gotten rid of toys or clothes in the past, I've always asked the kid who it had belonged to, or if it had been like a family item. I always talk to them about it first, and there have been times when I've been told, no, I'm not ready to pass that on. Yeah. And so we don't pass it on. And then there's been other times when I've been able to say, hey, you loved this shirt. It doesn't fit you anymore, but your little cousin could use it. Can we pass it on to him? And they've been totally fine with it. Or this thing that you haven't played with in 2 years and nobody's played with, are you still interested in it? Or could we donate it somewhere to somebody who might love to play with it and then could get some more life? And I think that at least I have to believe, and I could be wrong, it's a guess, but that not having things just disappear for our kids and feeling like they have no control over where they went actually potentially is leading to them being more willing to part with things because they're not feeling that like urgency. Like, I just don't know when mom's going to kind of put it in the bag and give it away. I think that because they know that they are part of the conversation and that it's not just going to disappear without any notice, they're more willing, to kind of pass it on when they're done.
Yeah. I also think, it reminds me of the discussion we've often had around sharing, where it's not really sharing if someone else makes you do it. And it also, the feeling is totally different between like, hey, I'm choosing to give these toys away and knowing that kids who don't have as many toys will be able to get them for free or at a discounted rate at Goodwill or whatever. And that feels really good that I can make that decision versus like my mom or dad came in and told me that I'm kind of being selfish because there's all these kids without toys out there. And if I don't give them away, then these kids are going to be sitting around with no toys to play with. Like that conversation, those two conversations are very, very different. And I think they spark very different feelings in our kids. One is one of like the opportunity for generosity and to give of themselves. And the other might be resentment of those very people that we care about, the less fortunate folks that don't have enough. I don't want my kids to resent them for scooping up all their toys. Just
or the little cousins who we want to pass things on to, or the little friends, whatever it is. I think when it comes to minimalism too, I wouldn't call myself a minimalist, but I'm not super involved in that movement, and it's not something that I kind of think about every day. But I also know about myself that I do a lot better when things are not as cluttered. I don't tend to amass clutter, and if I notice that I usually do like a big clean out because it drives me a little bit nuts.
What about that one counter in our house where the fish are? I feel like you amass clutter on that counter.
And then what did I do last night? I feel like we as a family amass clutter on that counter. And then last night I said, hey, can we clean this counter up? It's really bothering me. And you said, I am not in the mood to clean it right now.
And I took my computer off, which was the clutter that I had amassed on there. Those 2 papers I had, that's true.
Right.
And then the rest of it was yours.
It was not. It was all different family stuff. And one thing was a printer that you're supposed to put in the car that you haven't done yet. Anyway, you totally derailed where I was going.
No, it's going to get back on the rails in a second.
Okay.
I could tell.
All right. So anyway, I think that like I know about myself that I need somewhat of like a neater, cleaner space. And I know neat and clean is a little different than having things and not having things. But of course, it's easier to keep order when you have less stuff. But I think when I do engage with kind of minimalist writing or podcasts, because I do sometimes find it interesting, I think what I hear a lot is that people who are minimalists have found minimalism and it has been really deeply satisfying and fulfilling for them. And it's made them really happy to move towards a more minimalist lifestyle. And then when they talk, when I think about that and I think about people wanting to pass that value on to their children, I think the goal is really noble in that this has made me feel really happy and fulfilled. All the stuff was not making me happy, even though I thought it might. And I want my kids to grow up and not have that kind of urge to meet their needs or make themselves happy with stuff. I want them to be able to skip over that and just have the fulfillment that I have by being a minimalist. And I would say, like, if that's your goal for your kids, I understand where you're coming from, especially if you've had that life experience. I would also say that I would guess that kind of pushing that on our kids without them having a say in it is not going to make them minimalists. And if the thinking is like, my children will be more happy when they grow up, if they are minimalists, leaving space for them to be who they are and to find that on their own, while they're of course watching you live a more minimalist lifestyle for yourself, is probably, again, it's not like a sure bet. You just may not have a minimalist in your child, but it's probably more likely to lead them to kind of finding a place of balance with material possessions than just kind of making it this family value that they have no ability to have input on. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. I think you might have just absolutely crushed it, actually.
Oh, great.
No, I think that point was phenomenal. I think, and that's where it was just resonating with me so deeply on like when you've discovered something that brings you joy, you feel so strongly that you want to give that to your kids.
Right.
And I think that's where that longing has come from for us, like specifically with like outside fun. You and I have connected around that, and it's been such a huge source of joy for us.
Right. I guess it could apply to so many different things.
Of course it can. Yeah. That's what the light bulb kind of went off over my head here and especially with things, like minimalism, which I think made big steps towards reevaluating our relationship with things. Mm-hmm. I recall back when it was like the first time we moved out of the first home that we bought, and for that house, we weren't living very intentionally in terms of our purchasing decisions. And we had bought like this expensive furniture, because people tell you that when you buy furniture, you should buy the expensive stuff because it lasts a really long time, right? So we bought this expensive furniture, and it got damaged in the move when we switched homes. And we were like so angry about it in that day. And it was that week where I think I first heard about the concept of minimalism. And I was like, right. I was sitting around. I had paid a lot of money for the pleasure of having another thing that I had to worry a lot about.
Yeah,
like,
that was a big shift for us, I think.
And I remember coming home and being like, oh yeah, look, there's scratches on this furniture, and who cares? It still holds the clothes. Like, is it not going to impress whatever fictitious people in my mind were going to be impressed?
In our bedroom?
Yeah, exactly. Like, was I getting a big sense of satisfaction from staring at this stuff as it was like sitting there in the room? And if so, why? And I don't know. For me, the big takeaway was, oh, right, I can have a better, more intentional, healthier relationship with my things where I'm not worried about them. Same thing with like my car. Our car that I was so proud of that we bought got a dent in the back of it. And I remember at that point then being like, oh, okay, that car has a dent in it. That car still has the same dent.
Still works.
8 years later. But that was like such a big shift for me. So anyway, I think it's very natural that I would want to help my kids to see that they're not sitting there. Like I have many, many times in my life when like a thing gets damaged or lost, that feeling of like, I just lost a loved one, like,
right. Just
your stuff isn't a loved one.
Create so much upset.
But the value or the light bulb realization is like, it's just that instinct that I have of wanting to pass on to my kids comes from a very, very good place.
Yeah.
But like many things that I hope to pass on to my kids, I don't do that by forcing them. Yeah. Because it's satisfying for me now because I was able to adopt that for myself.
You came to it
right.
from a place of autonomy and...
Yeah, just discovery. Like, and I got to look to people who I trust, whose opinions I value, whether it was online or in person, see the effects that decision was having in their life and choose that for myself.
And you got to play around with it, right? You got to maybe try it a little bit and maybe backtrack if it wasn't quite feeling right, or maybe you backtracked and you didn't want to, and you got to feel what that felt like for you and kind of like double down on this commitment because it was important to you. Like all of these little, like you said, all of these little steps that go into kind of discovering a new value or a new way of life. That's what creates the value for a person, not being told from the time you're small that you must value this because mom and dad do.
Right. It's funny too, because I was being a little bit disparaging about people who get really proud of whatever value or life preference they have, whether it's being outdoorsy or like when we were very, very invested in more intentional eating, let's say, a lot of that community, there's kind of a similar vibe, but it actually, I think looking at that through the lens of assuming good intentions, It's just like, oh, well, I'm actually just feeling really great about this decision I'm making for myself. It's like,
and I want to share that with others.
Yeah. And so like when you see the person on Facebook who's like, hey, I found the keto diet and man, I'm like so happy with the changes to my body and my life now. That's really cool. And I would imagine, just from what little I know about the keto diet, that if someone came into their home and took out all of the non-keto foods and forced them through keto boot camp, whether they wanted to or not, it would feel totally different.
They'd have a totally different experience with it. And that's where I really think we risk a lot. If we have these really big values that feel really important to us that we hope our children will adopt. Again, I want to be careful and not set up the idea that we should expect by backing off and just modeling our kids will definitely adopt them, because I don't think that's really a healthy expectation to set, because again, our children are different people than us. But
well, then we're just sitting around just waiting, being like, I'm being this example.
Exactly.
Why aren't you doing this?
Right.
Yet?
But I would say that if you don't want to, I think if you don't want to, really just ruin any chance of your kids adopting this value, treading lightly and being really careful about not forcing them to live a value before they actually feel it to be valuable to them is a safer kind of way to go.
Right. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, like picture whatever the guru or the most charismatic person you know of in whatever space. So like, I know Leo Babauta is one of the big voices of minimalism on the internet. And so,
what's the name of Zen Habits? Is that his?
Well, Zen Habits, but he also has, I think, Minimalist. It's a different website. But anyway, Zen Habits is this huge blog that he has. But like, imagine, like, picture your kids living with Leo Babauta for a month or 2 months or something, or picture like you guys all move in together for a year. Like, do you think that person could, just by living the lifestyle that they live, be persuasive enough to help someone else adopt those values? Probably, right? Because they are so passionate about it and they so obviously see the value in it that it would be hard not to view that and view the person feeling contented and happy with that decision and like not at least consider it. You know what I mean? And I think that's what I hope to be for my kids, right? Like there are many things that I find to be very important and many things that bring me fulfillment. And I think that if my kids, by virtue of spending so much time with me and living in the same home as me and talking to me every day, if after all of that, they are unaware of whatever value that I claim to believe, then maybe I don't believe it as strongly as I'd like to think. That's a good point too,
right?
And if they don't adopt it, it won't be because they never knew about it. I remember hearing about this, like when people were discussing passing along their religion to their kids.
There's another big one.
A thought leader named Kenda Dean who worked with my mom and who I happened to get to know a little bit. And she wrote a book that I found fascinating called Almost Christian. And she was trying to suss out why so many people like our age and older were raised in the Christian church, but are no longer in the Christian church. Mm-hmm. And I thought this is a very, very timely question, and people will have all manner of different answers for this question. But one of the kind of questions she offers out there is, could it just be because their parents, they're quote unquote raising them in the church, but like deep down, they don't actually care that much about the church. Mm. They care enough to go to church and to bring the kids to church, but maybe they're not living that out at home all the time.
Right. It's not so clear that it's like a deeply ingrained value.
Sure. Or they're not like bringing up conversations around it casually because like ultimately maybe they're just out of a sense of obligation and not coming from a place of joyful exuberance around being a Christian, right?
Right. Around this just being something that's really, really close to their hearts and that they're super passionate about.
And to be fair, a lot of those people perhaps didn't choose that faith for themselves either. You know, I'm reminded of my brother who's a Buddhist, who chose that faith and that path for himself. And it's very hard, and not because he's like evangelical about it.
No, he's not at all.
You don't need to spend that much time to know that it's super important to him, right? Yeah. Like he's become a Buddhist meditation teacher. He takes time out of every one of his days to meditate. And like, you'll notice it because he's also fills up the room with his personality. And when he's like, hey, I'm going to go meditate for an hour. You couldn't live with my brother Kyle for a month and not at least have some questions about meditation, right?
Right.
And
maybe not see the benefit that it has had in his life, not because he sits there and tells you about the benefit, but because he's just a living example of somebody who's really pursuing a life of passion.
Yeah, and I think kids can draw that line a lot more easily than adults give them credit for. I think, especially when they can see, especially if the adult is willing to say, yeah, this meditation thing, well, it's so important to me that I'm going to carve out an hour every day to do it.
Yeah.
And the kid will probably sit there and think, well, isn't that boring? You're just like going to sit there silently. But ultimately, if it's a person they love and respect, that is going to give that idea or that value or that action a seat at the table, at least briefly, right?
Yeah, and it's that idea of when you said seat, I thought you were going to say seed, because I was going to say it's kind of like planting a seed, right? Like if we, as parents, are living our life according to the values that we hold most dear, that is planting a seed for our kids. And I think you said before, it's like we can know that as they continue to grow, they know that this value exists. They know it's an option for their lives.
Right.
And then hopefully, if we leave space for them to be making choices about it the whole way through, then they have the opportunity to come to it on their own should it become important to them and they've been exposed to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these types of a transition we'll move toward in a second is when these things are kind of like I think many people in the meditation community, for instance, probably would be opposed to forcing kids to meditate.
Yeah, totally.
But they would still view that as like, known many people for whom meditation has been very impactful. They would still be like, man, but I really hope that they will do it someday. But there's a fine line, I think, between, man, I really hope my kid finds the joy of meditation versus like, I really hope that my kid, say, doesn't become an alcoholic, or like, I think at some point there are things that we feel so strongly about that it feels like something higher stakes than I hope that my kid, like I think many people, if they had to make a list of all of the things that they hope their kids would become or would embrace, and the list of things that they hope their kids will avoid or not embrace, then some things would just feel more urgent. Before we pivot in that direction, Can I just say a couple more things about kind of a minimalist lifestyle when maybe you and or your spouse value minimalism and your kids don't? Okay. I just think that there's some more, like the idea, just like some more concrete thoughts around that. Yeah, I have more thoughts about just also supporting our kids if they decide to share values that we don't too. So yeah, go ahead. So I think when it comes to minimalism, like I talked about, like James, I think is kind of just like a natural minimalist. Like you just because I'm lazy. No, but like you don't really engage. Like it's not like you go out and say I'm a minimalist. You're not like working towards becoming more minimalist in that many ways. Like I feel like in a lot of ways that's just kind of who you are. It's your state of being. Like, you're not wanting a lot of things. Do you know what I mean? Well, it's funny. Does that make sense, or am I just totally wrong? Do I not know you at all? Well, that's how I've become, for sure. I think it's like a value I adopted for myself that has brought me the most joy. Incidentally, is I pride myself on being able to hear an idea and assess whether I feel like it's a good idea and then make a decision to embrace it or not pretty quickly. So like, for instance, when I don't know if I've ever talked about this on the podcast before, but like when I decided to stop ever drinking too much, right? I wouldn't have ever called myself an alcoholic, but I had a tendency to, many people do, just like drink alcohol for fun. And then I decided that it wasn't giving me more than it was taking away. So I stopped just in a day. When I heard these ideas about minimalism, I stopped buying clothes for myself, basically. Like it's like sometimes I have to order the socks. Yeah, like I go in a given year, I'll buy socks, blue jeans, and khaki shorts because those are what I wear. Because you wear them so much that they... And I wear them out. Although now with my barefoot tendencies, I also... Less socks needed. Fewer socks needed. It's fewer in that case, no offense. And I love you too. Yeah, okay. Thanks for the grammar fix. No sweat. That's so rude. Grammar, because I don't know. I just got that instinct to troll you there. And I normally would do that on the podcast, but I wanted to, so I did. But anyway, a little flavor of life. That was really the decision, because it's funny, you probably won't recall this now, but like before we had kids, I went on a kick where I wanted more fashionable clothes. And I was like trying to really focus on like getting shirts that fit perfectly. Fashion phase. It was a very brief phase, yeah. But I was buying those like nicer shirts. I was really focused on fit and like just because in my mind, you still have a few. They look pretty good. I know they do. Yeah, thanks. Sure. I was like all about like the seam falling right at the shoulder because I felt at the time like that was the I don't know, the best way to buy clothes.
Yeah.
Why not just buy clothes
It's
that fit?
fine.
Who knows?
Yeah.
And so it's less that I'm a natural minimalist and more that I've moved toward just wanting to follow the things I do believe, I guess. So
Sure.
like, I'm very unlikely to, impulse buy really anything.
Right.
But it's not because I think it's wrong. It's just because I like don't want to.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, okay. So that's how you are.
So, yeah.
I think I'm less inclined towards minimalism, but like I said before, clutter and mess really drives me crazy, and owning a lot of things leads towards more likelihood for clutter and mess. So and just thinking about like, if you're like that and your kids are less minimalistic than you are and they like to have their things around, I think there's ways around it. And I think it starts by, obviously it depends how old your kids are, but if your kids are old enough, it just starts by having a conversation with them, right? With the whole family of like, listen, this is how it makes me feel when the house is super cluttered and messy. Right. And I also understand that you like your things and you like to have them around. So like, do we have any ideas as a family about how we can keep those things around for you, but also create a way for me to not have that mess? And it could come up, you never know what you and your kids are going to come up with together. So it could come up with a really cool idea that I am not even thinking of right now. But some ideas are like, kids do have their own bedroom, or bedroom be whatever it is, right? And just because you don't really have to go in there that much if you don't want to. Obviously, like you might help them go to bed and things like that. But kind of saying like, in your bedroom, like I'll help you if you want it to be neater, but let's keep the things in your bedroom, keep it as cluttered as feels good for you. And then in this main family space that we all have to live in, could we kind of like pare it down a little bit? So that's one thing that you can do. Some people in our group had really great ideas just for like organizing things, like you said, on shelves. Like sometimes you can just organize your things a little more. And again, I know that if you're really a minimalist, that might not feel awesome either, because you're like, well, I don't want to spend my time dealing with all this stuff. Again, I think it's worth talking with your kids and thinking about how can they participate in keeping things somewhat organized so that everybody can feel okay. I also think if you like super clean, uncluttered spaces, is there a space in your house that could be yours to be that way? So whether it's one corner of your own bedroom, whether it's a home office, whether it's kitchen, like what space can you create to be kind of like your little haven that is less cluttered? I think that there's, again, just a lot of creative solutions that we can come around to together when we just open up the conversation to everybody. And when we're just really honest about how it makes us feel, when we ask our kids how they feel about it. And when our kids know that we're coming to them, not with an agenda of like ultimately having it come out exactly how we want anyway, but when we're really open to everybody's ideas and coming to like a mutually beneficial solution, I think it can be pretty magical.
I think so too. And I really love the point of having your space where you can manifest your values and then helping them to have their space where it can be however they want it to be, because that also allows for contrast and allows for them to kind of see like, oh, well, I see how that is. I see how that feels.
Yeah.
I see how this is, like my space and how that feels. And I think about Ollie, our oldest son, who we interviewed here on the podcast. I remember at one point he was reflecting on how he really loves how Grandma and Pop keep their silverware, because famously just dump all of our silverware into one big drawer.
It's mostly because we lost the divider in a move and we just never got a new one.
That's part of it, but I also really like it because I don't have to spend time sorting silverware.
When you unload the dishwasher, right?
I just dump the whole thing in. And
it's nice and loud when you do that.
It is, but and I'm doing the dishes, so people can deal if they want to put the silverware away.
I do. I just do it quieter.
Everyone is welcome to do that. But anyway, he like comes over here in our podcast studio, my parents' house, right next door. And he reflected one day, oh, I really love how orderly your silverware drawer is, Grandma. So for him, he got to choose like our really cluttered, incidentally, silverware drawer versus that more orderly one. But he could see the difference and say like, oh, I choose this. And I think, again, if our values, there's a very high chance that certain values that we hold probably will resonate with our kids, right? Like, I think most people deep down don't like a really messy space. That's my suspicion. And there are probably some people
some people can kind of withstand it or deal with it more than others. Yeah, you can.
Yeah, I have, or I've been able to in the past. You've kind of ruined me for that now by being so, I really appreciate tidiness now too, but it's probably the same contrast thing, right? Like I could visit you in college to your very tidy room, coming out of my room with potato chips under the bed and all that stuff. And you're shaking your head. I'm giving you flashbacks.
I famously cleaned his room once when I showed up to visit him at college because I couldn't even be in it until it was clean.
Yeah, and at the time there was one bag of potato chips face down on the corner of the bed, and all the potato chips spilled out underneath. So we've moved on, but there's been a lot of growth there. And so anyway, I think offering that contrast, you can do that in a number of different ways. You can do that with eating as well. You can do that, and you can reflect on how good you feel after a good meal. I think there's all different manner of ways you can do that. I want to segue a little bit here.
Sure.
Because I think there's a lot to like more of a middle ground area where I think people do feel a greater sense of urgency. I mean, we talked about religious views. I know it can be really hard in a lot of households when kids aren't embracing the religious views of their parents, because many people who are very religious feel like it's really important.
Yeah, of course.
Understandably, a lot of, religious doctrine says it's very important to believe that religion. So that can be a big source of pain.
Yeah. And I don't think we have as much experience with that, just in terms of, I'm
more just acknowledging it. And,
yeah.
I've seen it happen countless number of times. I already alluded to a fairly big transition in our culture, which is one from virtually every home, being involved in some religion or another. And in many areas in the country, very, very few homes being involved in some religion or another. So, that transition, I think, has been very hard for a lot of people. I think another one, just one that's more close to home for me was when, we were moving towards trying to eat what we believe to be ethically raised meats. We started as being fairly strict as vegetarians in general. I think we moved toward, supporting local farmers who were treating their animals in humane ways before harvesting them and so forth. And, as we were doing this, we started to have this question. So we would go out to a get together and someone was just serving hot dogs or whatever from the local grocery store. And, one of our kids wanted one. And
right. Right.
And,
knowing that I wouldn't want to eat that myself based on the decisions I've made for myself. Yeah, that was tough.
And I'm personally not all about a lot of what I perceive to be the processes involved in raising that kind of meat. And I was like, I'm not going to go take that hot dog out of my kid's hands.
Right.
He just wants to eat it, and eating is deeply personal, and those sorts of values are really personal. And so I think we just kind of looked at each other for a second and just kind of shrugged, and we're like, this is kind of weird, but we went with it and
let them eat it.
Yeah, for sure. And now we're at a place where, we've maintained those values for ourselves. One of our kids has, I think he's adopted it even more strictly than we have.
Yeah.
Erring on the side of whenever possible, just not eating meat.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our kids doesn't care at all. And the other one's totally oblivious.
Because he's two.
Because he's two.
Well, I would say too, that when we kind of looked at each other and shrugged and just, said, go for it. I would also add that in and around that, not at that very moment, but there have been conversations in our family. So our kids are aware of why we've made the choices that we've made. Right. So that they have the information from which we are making our decisions, and not in a way that we want them to feel ashamed, right? The one who is okay eating any meat. We don't present it to him in we're making this really ethical decision and you should too. Otherwise you're making a bad one. We just talk about this is what we learned and this is why we make this decision. And we're going to support you to decide what you want to do.
And I think he's aware of that now. It's just not something that he spends a lot of bandwidth focusing on. He's at a party, he's going to eat a hamburger.
He's hungry, And
I understand that some people feel more passionately about that, and they might want to, for instance, and I think, it's funny. So around this particular value, it's something, it's hard to not know if you live in our house that's our value, right? We just go out, we go to a totally different store to buy our meat,
and we eat probably less meat than the typical American family because it's more expensive to get the meat that we eat.
Right. And it's very obvious, our kids are a part of our lives, right? So they go shopping with us. They see this, and we are happy to talk about why we make the decisions we make. And so at that point, though, I really like that we kick it back to our kids and kind of put the ball in their court in as non-judgmental a way as possible. Because again, I feel satisfaction knowing that I'm supporting methods of raising food that I can believe in, and I feel satisfaction in my kids seeing that it's an intentional decision for me, whatever path they ultimately choose for themselves. I like that I've modeled intentional thinking around living or eating and whatnot. And I know a lot of really happy people that just don't care about what meat they eat. and they're doing fine. And like, I hope that the world will move more in the direction that I feel is best.
Sure.
But I don't want to force anyone to do what I feel is best.
I will say that it was, again, like that was a tough decision for us. So if that's something that you're struggling with, I get it, because not only was it a decision about supporting the practices involved in raising the meat, but also the health factor to me and what those animals were potentially eating that then that was going to be getting to us by eating it. Or antibiotics and hormones and all of those things. And so that, I'm just laying that out to explain that it really wasn't an easy decision. But ultimately to us, the benefits of kind of letting our kids decide for themselves outweighed the cons. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think too, like when we think about the pros and the cons of all of this, understand that I think that and I'm just going to make a blanket assertion here, and I, don't necessarily have facts to back this up, but my fairly extensive experience working with my own kids and other people's children is that there's precious little that we're going to be able to impart to our kids as non-negotiable values. Which is to say, like, I draw this example from the summer camp environment, but when kids come to camp, I feel like I can draw a straight line between how many rules I have and how willing people are to follow the rules that I set forth, right? And so I think, sharing values is very similar here. And if I have a long list of guidelines that my kids must follow, my kids are going to be increasingly less likely to follow all of them the more I add to them, right?
Yeah.
And especially when those values, and the other like important distinction in my mind is where intelligent people can disagree. If I'm forcing my kids to adopt a value that intelligent people would disagree about. So like, one in my mind is the pros and cons of video game usage. Okay.
Yeah.
We've talked about this at length on the show. Gaming is a big part of our kids' lives. It's something they've chosen for themselves, of course, and we've supported them in that to the degree that we're able to. Intelligent people do, whatever your beliefs are, intelligent people disagree about this, okay?
Totally.
They're very, very smart people.
In terms of, is it beneficial? Is it
PhDs,
damaging? Whatever, yeah.
People are weighing in on both sides. And so in the same way that you probably wouldn't force your kids to play video games because you believed in the benefits of them, you probably... I would not want to stop my kids from playing them because I believed that they shouldn't do them. Just because, again, that intelligent people disagree thing is a pretty good benchmark for me. You won't find a lot of intelligent disagreement about things like respecting other people's bodily autonomy.
Yeah.
Right?
So do we want to talk about the few non-negotiables?
Well, I'm just going to start just to finish out this.
I'm jumping the gun.
That's
sorry.
Okay, dude.
All right.
You're good. You're
okay.
Good. And I think the main benefit of deeply prioritizing those as the non-negotiables in your home is that where there's really, really good societal disagreement or agreement rather about these things, I feel like kids are very unlikely to act out on those later on, right? So if you have very, firm standards about bodily autonomy in your home, you're pretty unlikely for your kid to like go over a friend's house and they're like, oh, in this family, we just touch anyone wherever we want,
Right.
It's like, so they're not going to have to do the math. Like, it's just going to be such a consistent example that's been set for them that they can choose to adopt. They will be very, very likely to choose to adopt it. The benefits will be obvious. You'll be, kind of following through on that in your home, not taking other people's things. This is a gray area. Sometimes people force people to share, but, by and large, and then if you stick really, really firmly to those and lead them by example. Right.
And they're not coming from a place of having so many rules and non-negotiables and guidelines that they are just compelled to, respond to that in an attempt to claim their own autonomy, right? Like if we have all these rules, so many rules and guidelines and quote non-negotiables, first of all, I think it dilutes them all, right? Like you're saying, like the big ones, they really lose their meaning. And our kids are going to hit a point, I would fear, where they're just like, oh my gosh, what can I do? Right. And then they're going to kind of look for it wherever they can.
Yeah. And I think they'll be in the habit of wanting, well, it's funny. You want them to be in the habit of questioning you, probably.
Yeah, for sure.
And you probably don't want them to be in the habit, your kids to be in the habit of finding things they ought to disagree with you on, if that makes sense. So like, I've just observed this behavior in kids that our kids have spent time with, where especially kids that come from houses with a longer list of rules, I've noticed that, those kids tend to be the ones who want to push back against all rules or all standards in a given community. And so I've had talks with kids like that. Like, you may have noticed that in our house, we don't have a lot of, say, firm guidelines around video games, but we do have firm guidelines around honesty here. Like, I know that it's sometimes hard for you to perhaps get your needs met without being dishonest. But in our house, like, we just have pretty firm guidelines around honesty.
And you can be honest here, and we can move towards meeting everyone's needs still. And we're still going to welcome you and accept you.
Right. And so I hope that for our kids that they see that they just have a really clear message of the things that are important, and that I'm judicious enough about what's important that they won't see inconsistency in that in the world and in their experience. And they might find people that are very, very happy and fulfilled with houses filled with stuff, and if the message I've given is, here's a choice I make, other people make other choices, go for it, I feel like that's going to be good versus, I don't know. Yeah,
well, versus dad says that the way to be happy is by owning fewer things. And then I go out into the world and I see people owning a lot of things and feeling really happy. Like, does dad really know what he's talking about?
Exactly. So when dad comes around and says, also the way to be happy is to respect everyone's bodily autonomy and to try to be as honest as possible. But he also said all those other wrong stuff. So,
so like, what should I trust here? Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So then it makes me a more credible example for the things that happen when I'm really serious about things that I would call them principles, that most people can agree are just like bedrock foundational principles for a functioning society.
That perhaps are, or almost definitely are, just better than the alternative.
Yeah. Or that, we've seen societies function best. Yeah. I don't want to get into a discussion about relativism perhaps, but like we've seen that societies tend to function best when people respect one another's property, respect one another's bodies, and are honest with one another, to the degree that it's feasible.
So are those our non-negotiables? Like, if we're talking about our family and our non-negotiables. And when I say non-negotiable, obviously we recognize that our kids are going to make mistakes, right? And when our kids make mistakes, we could talk about what we do, but
places where, and I'll even like hedge on the honesty piece, just because
I would too.
You can be honest to a fault, like we've talked about.
Yeah, I would. I don't think that's in our like top tier of.
Yeah, it's more like, but one thing would be like keeping your agreements. That's a phrase that gets uttered in our house a lot, because that is important to me. Like, if you say you're going to do something, that you do it, and that there is context around that. You have to really understand what you're agreeing to. You can't force someone else to agree to something that they didn't understand and make them do it or whatever. But I think those are a place to start,
I would say, I think if we're talking about in our house, the things that we really, really hold as, like, you could say principles that we are going to push back on if our kids are for some reason demonstrating that they're not living these out would be, like basically non-aggression principle, right? Not aggressing against other people. Not
taking their things.
And not taking their things. So that's a big one for us that, we're not, really willing to give a lot of space on. So, and we've talked about that before in episodes when we've talked about, like, what do we do when our toddler is hitting our baby, right? Or when our kid is aggressing against another kid. And we've talked about how we really do step in and make sure that behavior stops.
Yeah. And there's better and worse ways to do that.
Of
and
course.
You can dig into those on other episodes. But, when we talk about wanting to impart our values on our kids, we're just wanting to distinguish. And I think it's fairly obvious, ultimately. It's not any sort of like huge insight that there are going to be issues you take more seriously in your home than others. And I think the best strategy that I've observed is to try to lend the appropriate amount of weight to some values over others. And I think that there's, again, where we hope that our kids will, like, because ultimately, if someone is deciding between hurting others or not, I don't really care if they're doing it for like some matter of fulfillment or not. Like,
right.
Yeah. Like,
you don't get to hurt other people for your own fulfillment if that for some reason fulfills you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like, whereas like you can ski, I hope that you ski and you enjoy it. If you don't want to ski, no worries. I hope that you don't hurt others and enjoy not hurting others. But if you want to hurt others, you still can't.
There are some worries, right? You just still can't do that.
So it's like, but I think, part of parenting consistently and giving our kids a consistent viewpoint on the world is having really reasonable, easy to understand boundaries versus more ambiguous boundaries around like, well, we say we're minimalists, but like I notice my dad just got a new suit or whatever, right? And so, just embodying the principles we want to see in the world and, deciding when it makes sense to draw a line in the sand and put your foot down and say, this is something we must do. And
I think I'd like to encourage everybody, and this is something that I've had to do repeatedly for myself, and I'm sure I will continue to have to do, to really like, if you have a principle or value that you are viewing as non-negotiable with your family, give it one more look, right? And you might give it one more look and peel back some layers and think, this really is non-negotiable. Or after listening to us talk about this, you might think like, wait a minute, like maybe this is a little more negotiable than I thought. Like maybe I want to hold on to this for myself, but I don't want to require that my kids live it right now. So how can we make a few adjustments in our lives so that I can keep living this value, but I can open up some space around it so that my kids can come to it on their own if they want to.
Right. It's like be the change you want to see in your family.
Yeah.
And understand that probably most of the values you hold most dear these days, you probably didn't hold them as strongly when you were 5.
Right. You probably came to them on your own. And I mean, there's something really powerful in giving kids that agency over developing their own value system, obviously within the framework of living in this supportive, value-driven family. And I think that I know that it can be scary sometimes to let go a little bit because, again, the things that make us happy, we perceive them as the things sometimes that are going to make our children happy. So it can be really scary to let go, but I would really encourage just like a little more digging into that for people if this is sounding interesting to you.
It sounded interesting to me.
Well,
I felt like it was a good
You find yourself very interesting, so that makes sense.
I find you interesting too, to be fair. So that's it.
So that's it. Thanks so much for joining us on this journey. And remember that each moment is a new opportunity to be the parent that you want to be.
Love you guys. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to One Free Family. If you enjoy the podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron at onefreefamily.com/support. Your support will help make this show better. Plus, you can get access to rewards and additional episodes by joining. Again, that's onefreefamily.com/support. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.